Robert Mitchell carried a burden few people knew. His great-great-grandfather, James Mitchell, had been an officer aboard a Portuguese merchant ship that mysteriously vanished in 1847, the infamous Black Hope. Throughout his academic career as a professor of naval history, Robert obsessively searched for any trace of the vessel, a fixation that cost him his marriage and distanced him from his children. "You can't bring the dead back, Robert," his ex-wife used to say before she left, taking the kids. But there was something else. Since childhood, Robert had suffered recurring nightmares of drowning in dark waters, pale hands dragging him downward. Doctors diagnosed him with anxiety disorder, but medication had never really helped. That rainy March afternoon in New York, Robert stepped into a small auction hall. The catalog didn't list anything remarkable, yet something compelled him to attend. The same inexplicable intuition that had often guided his research. "Final lot, unlisted item," the auctioneer announced with visible discomfort. A ship's log dated 1847, recovered from a family estate. Belonged to the merchant vessel, Black Hope. Robert felt his blood freeze. The sound of the rain seemed to vanish. The scar on his left wrist, the result of a suicide attempt after his last failed expedition, began to throb. "Opening bid, $50, continued the auctioneer, avoiding eye contact with the object on the table. When the gavel struck at $200, the auctioneer looked eager to be rid of it. As he wrapped the log, he whispered to Robert, "The man who brought this in died 3 days later. Said the book contained words that should never be spoken aloud. Superstition, of course." He hesitated. "Still, you might want to read it silently." Back at his seaside apartment, Robert couldn't wait. Ignoring the warning, he placed the journal under his lamp and began to read aloud, as he always did with historical documents. May 12, 1847. "We departed Lisbon with fair winds and full cargo. Captain Blackwood remains secretive about our exact route, having received sealed instructions from the shipowners. Rumors among the crew speak of a map found in a wreck near the African coast. May God protect us, for I sense something dark awaits us beyond the horizon." The voice that came from his mouth as he read did not sound entirely like his own. Robert awoke disoriented on the floor of his study. His clock read 3:47 a.m. The journal lay open, though he didn't recall having read that far. The page displayed a meticulous drawing of a constellation he didn't recognize, annotated in handwriting different from the earlier entries. In the days that followed, inexplicable phenomena began to manifest. The persistent smell of salt water and rotting wood permeated his apartment. His antique wall clock, a family heirloom, now perpetually showed 3:47, and when he tried to fix it, the hand spun freely until returning to that same time. One particularly stormy night, Robert discovered wet footprints in his hallway, larger than his own and shaped like old nautical boots. They led to his bed and ended abruptly. Despite their clearly wet appearance, no actual water remained. His only friend in the building, retired psychiatrist Dr. Helen Voss, knocked on his door the following morning. "Robert, there's salt water dripping from my ceiling. The building manager said your apartment is the only one above mine." "Impossible," he replied, inviting her in to check. The floor was completely dry. Helen noticed the journal on the table and her expression changed. "Is that what you found at the auction? May I see it?" Reluctantly, Robert let her examine it, but not touch. Helen studied the cover for a few minutes. "There's a rare condition, called shared psychosis," she began cautiously. "Objects that carry trauma can theoretically transfer psychotic narratives to susceptible individuals. You do have a family history of mental illness, remember? Your father was obsessed with the Black Hope, too." "This isn't madness," Robert snapped. "Look at this." He showed her an entry dated June 1847. First Officer James Mitchell formally objected to the captain's new orders. "Our course now leads us directly to what the natives call the Abyss of Souls. Mitchell seems to be the only sane man aboard this ship of madmen. His ancestor's name, documented in a journal no one had ever seen, it was the proof he'd been searching for his entire life." Helen frowned. "This proves nothing, Robert. You could have written that during a dissociative episode." "I've never touched these pages before," he insisted. "Then how do you explain this?" Helen pointed to the corner of the page, where small spots of fresh blood stained the aged paper. Robert looked at his own fingers. Small cuts he hadn't noticed were bleeding. He began finding journal entries he didn't remember reading. They grew increasingly disturbing, blending nautical reports with rising tensions aboard the ship. 3 distinct styles of handwriting emerged, one formal and meticulous, clearly the official logkeeper, another rough and heavy-handed, likely Captain Blackwood, and a third, jagged and erratic, scrawled in the margins, often contradicting the official narrative. One entry, dated August 2, 1847, was written in reddish ink Robert suspected was dried blood. "The abyss calls us. The captain is blind to the danger, seduced by the map's promises. Holloway has slowly turned the crew against the officers. Mitchell was the only one who saw the signs, but no one listened. The first mate was found with his throat slit this morning. Mutiny is inevitable. This ship will never reach its official destination." The next morning, after reading that passage, Robert awoke on his balcony, drenched in rain, with no memory of how he'd gotten there. In his right hand, he clutched a small sailor's knife engraved with the initials AH. His computer was on, and an email had been sent during the night to the university's history department, announcing a special lecture on the true fate of the Black Hope. Disturbed, Robert began recording himself while he slept. The footage grew increasingly alarming. In one clip, he sat upright at exactly 3:47 a.m., speaking alternately in 3 different voices. "The ritual must be completed," said a raspy voice with a thick British accent. "The portal must open again." "You ruined everything, Holloway," another voice answered in 19th century American English. "You killed innocent men out of greed." "It wasn't greed," replied a third, deeper voice. "It was survival. You don't understand what waits beyond. Time doesn't exist there. Death is just an illusion." Robert began frantically researching regression and possession, consulting both scholars and occultists. An elder from a Gullah Geechee community, expert in African spiritual traditions, examined a photo of the journal and refused to touch the screen. "That object doesn't just hold memories," she explained. "It holds Egan, spirits trapped between worlds by an ancient pact. 3 main souls struggle for control: the officer who documented everything, the captain who sought riches, and the mutineer who discovered something beyond human understanding." "How do I get rid of it?" Robert asked, desperate. "Maybe you shouldn't," she replied. "Maybe it's your destiny to finish what began generations ago." The lecture on the Black Hope drew an unexpectedly large crowd. Robert spoke for 3 hours without pause, displaying an eloquence his colleagues had never seen. He seamlessly alternated between modern English, 19th century vernacular, and archaic British accents, depending on whose perspective he was narrating. The mutiny was not just rebellion against Captain Blackwood's cruelty, he explained, or perhaps something explained through him. It was a philosophical divide about the voyage's true purpose. Officially, the Black Hope carried spices and textiles from the east. In truth, it sought what ancient Portuguese maps called the Kronos Rift, a point in the ocean where, under certain celestial alignments, the laws of nature bend. A senior maritime historian stood up, visibly shaken. "How do you know this?" "That theory has never been published." "Because I was there," Robert replied softly, drawing a grave silence across the auditorium. After a deliberate pause, he smiled. "I was there, in the primary sources, of course." He awoke in his car after the lecture with no memory of how he got there. On the passenger seat, the journal lay open to a new page, a detailed map of an ocean region near the Cape of Good Hope, annotated in an unknown language. Over the map was a celestial diagram showing a specific star alignment. Back home, he discovered he had purchased navigation equipment and booked a small boat at the local marina for the following night, the very date marked on the map as convergence. Robert struggled against the forces controlling him. During moments of clarity, he locked himself indoors, trying to resist the compulsion to complete the entity's plans. Concerned by his mental deterioration, Helen obtained a court order for involuntary psychiatric admission. When the orderlies arrived, the apartment was empty. Symbols drawn in a mixture of ink and blood covered the walls. In the center of the living room, the journal lay open to its final page, a text written in a language older than Latin, accompanied by a disturbing illustration of a rift in the ocean from which impossible shapes emerged. Robert regained partial consciousness aboard the rented boat, already far out at sea. The night was unnaturally still, the ocean a black mirror reflecting the constellations above. Using the map and an antique sextant he didn't remember acquiring, he navigated to exact coordinates. At 3:47 a.m., the stars aligned exactly as shown in the diagram. Robert, or whatever now inhabited him, began to recite words from the journal in a language older than any known civilization. The water around the boat began to bubble, not from heat, but from a supernatural cold that crystallized the surface in impossible patterns. "This is where we fail again," said the officer's voice through him. "As we did in 1847, in 1623 with the Spanish galleon, in 941 with the Viking Drakkar, and in every cycle before. This time we will finish the ritual," Holloway's voice replied. "This time we have the blood of Mitchell's descendant." The circle closes. Robert realized in horror that the knife with H initials was in his hand, pressed against the scar from his previous suicide attempt. He understood. He wasn't just a vessel for past spirits, he was part of a cycle, predestined since birth for this moment. With a supreme act of will, Robert briefly regained control. His mind cleared in a moment of absolute understanding. The Black Hope hadn't been the first ship to attempt the ritual. It was merely one in a long chain of efforts dating back to forgotten eras. The goal wasn't wealth or power, it was to open a portal to a place where time did not exist, where death held no meaning. "You don't understand," Captain Blackwood's voice whispered. "It's not about escaping death. It's about transcending human existence." Beneath the boat, something massive stirred. The water turned translucent, revealing the spectral outlines of submerged ships. Not just one, but many. The Black Hope, an older Portuguese caravel, a Spanish galleon, a Viking longship, and vessels so ancient Robert couldn't identify them. Among the ghost ships, a rift began to open in the very fabric of reality, revealing a space between dimensions where impossible forms moved. Ancestral voices called to Robert, promising knowledge beyond human comprehension. That's when he knew what he had to do. He might not be the first to resist the cycle, but he could be the last. "The cycle ends now," he declared, using his own voice for the first time in days. Instead of cutting his wrist as the ritual required, Robert stabbed the knife into the journal, piercing it completely. Using his own blood, he drew a protective symbol he'd seen in childhood dreams. Not a symbol to open portals, but to seal them. The ocean exploded in supernatural fury. The boat was hurled upward as if struck by a titanic force from the deep. Robert clutched the pierced journal and threw himself into the sea, holding the book tight against his chest as he sank. Beneath the surface, he was surrounded by the faces of hundreds of sailors from different eras. Some in 19th century uniforms, others in medieval garments, and some in clothing so old they belonged to forgotten civilizations. Among them, he recognized a face identical to his own, except wearing a Portuguese naval uniform from 1847. His great-great-grandfather, James Mitchell. "You did what none of us could," said the apparition. "The circle is broken." As he sank deeper, Robert felt no fear or despair, only a profound peace, as if he had finally fulfilled the purpose for which he had been born. The first time Jessie heard the 3 knocks, she was in a deep sleep after an exhausting day at work. The sound echoed through the room, 3 sharp, deliberate raps that jolted her awake. Confused and disoriented, she looked at the clock. Exactly 3:07 a.m. She got up abruptly, turned on the light, and went to the door, but when she opened it, she found only the silent, empty hallway of her apartment. She convinced herself it had been part of a dream, or perhaps a neighbor knocking on a wall. She went back to bed, turned off the light, and tried to sleep again, ignoring the unsettling feeling that those knocks had something different about them, something personal. In the following days, as the knocks repeated at the same time, Jessie started crafting rational explanations. Old pipes in the building, a sleepless neighbor with strange habits, or even her own brain playing tricks on her due to accumulated stress at work. She had always been a skeptic and a practical person, raised by scientist parents who taught her to seek logical explanations for seemingly inexplicable phenomena. Even when the knocks began affecting her sleep, leaving her irritable and exhausted during the day, she insisted on denying any supernatural possibility. 2 weeks later, convinced the problem was in her apartment, Jessie decided to spend the weekend at her best friend Clara's house. She didn't mention the knocks, embarrassed to seem superstitious or mentally unstable. She slept in the guest room and for the first time in days felt truly relaxed. But at 3:07 a.m., the 3 knocks echoed on the door of the room where she slept. Her heart raced and cold sweat ran down her back. When she opened the door, she saw only Clara sleeping peacefully in the room next door. The next morning, she asked if Clara had come to her room during the night, which Clara firmly denied. Trying to keep her composure, Jessie began to question her own sanity. The following week, a business trip took her to a hotel in another city, hundreds of miles away. Now I'll prove this is all in my head, she thought as she lay in the hotel bed. But at 3:07 a.m., the 3 knocks echoed on the door, just as real and clear as in her own home. The nightmare followed her no matter where she went. When she returned home, she began obsessively researching sleep disorders, auditory hallucinations, and rare medical conditions, desperate for an explanation that could restore her faith in the reality she had always known. The persistence of the knocks began to consume every aspect of Jessie's life. Her work performance deteriorated, her friendships suffered, and the deep circles under her eyes betrayed her sleepless nights. Determined to find an answer, she saw doctors, psychiatrists, and even a neurologist who ran a series of tests on her brain. Everything appears perfectly normal, was the unanimous conclusion, with some suggesting she might be suffering from PTSD from an event she couldn't even recall. In despair, Jessie finally abandoned her skepticism and sought help from less conventional sources. She visited a medium recommended by a co-worker, who, upon connecting with Jessie, turned pale and refused to continue the session. She consulted a parapsychologist who installed recording equipment in her bedroom, but the knocks, while clearly audible to Jessie, never appeared in the recordings. She read countless books on paranormal phenomena, haunted house stories, and near-death experiences, searching for parallels to her own situation. One night, while researching online, she found an obscure forum where someone described an experience nearly identical to hers. Knocks at night, always at the same time. The thread ended abruptly with the last post reading, "I'll answer tonight. If I don't post again, you'll know what happened." That user was never heard from again. After nearly 3 months of nightly torment, Jessie could no longer distinguish what was real from what was the product of her exhausted mind. Her once tidy and clean apartment turned into a chaos of open books, scattered notes, and empty coffee cups. The white walls were now covered in calendars where she meticulously marked each occurrence of the knocks, trying to find a pattern beyond the constant time. She installed cameras, high-sensitivity audio recorders, and even motion sensors in front of her door. One night, the motion sensor triggered exactly at 3:07, but the camera showed absolutely nothing. That's when Jessie began to consider a disturbing possibility. What if the knocks weren't coming from outside in, but from somewhere within herself? She remembered a theory she'd read about parallel universes, where different versions of ourselves live slightly altered lives. Could it be another version of her trying to make contact? Or something more sinister? Her sleepless hours were now filled with increasingly elaborate and unlikely theories, while her connection to the outside world dwindled. She was placed on medical leave from work, and her friends, worried but powerless, began to drift away. The isolation only deepened her obsession. On a rainy Sunday afternoon, while watching raindrops stream down her bedroom window, Jessie made a decision. She was tired of running, tired of fearing the knocks, tired of hiding under the covers with her eyes tightly shut whenever the clock struck 3:07. That night she would answer. She prepared herself mentally all day, contemplating every possibility, from finding nothing to facing a supernatural entity. Whether it's a ghost, a demon, or just my own madness, I'm going to face it, she told herself as she got ready for bed. She placed a notebook and pen beside her to document whatever might happen. As the night wore on, she felt a strange, almost supernatural calm, as if she were finally in control. 5 minutes before 3:07, she was already wide awake, sitting up straight in bed, staring fixedly at the door. Her heart beat slow and steady like a metronome counting down the seconds. Then, precisely at 3:07, the familiar 3 knocks rang out, clearer and sharper than ever. Taking a deep breath, Jessie got up, walked to the door with steady steps, and for the first time in months, spoke toward the source of the sound. "Who's there?" After a silence that felt like an eternity, a voice answered, a voice identical to her own, but worn as if it had been screaming for years. "Finally. Now I can leave." The door creaked open slowly, revealing not a hallway, but a kind of distorted mirror of reality. On the other side stood herself, or something that wore her face, a paler reflection with sunken eyes and disheveled hair, wearing the exact clothes Jessie had worn the day the knocks first began. "Who are you?" Jessie asked, her voice trembling. "I'm you," the figure replied. "Trapped between realities after you ignored the warning." It explained that months ago, when Jessie narrowly avoided a car accident by swerving at the last second, in another reality she didn't. She died. But something went wrong. Her consciousness got stuck between worlds, unable to move on. The only way to escape was to make contact with her living counterpart and trade places. The knocks had been the only possible form of communication, and the time, 3:07, was the exact moment of her death in that other reality. "I can't return to the world of the living," said the entity, "but I can finally move on if you take my place." Before Jessie could react, the figure stepped forward, touching her fingers with icy hands. A dizzying sensation overtook her, and when she regained awareness, she was on the other side of the door, looking at her own body, now smiling with a look of profound relief. The door began to close, and no matter how much Jessie screamed and knocked, no one could hear her. That's when she realized the terrible truth. She was trapped in that limbo between worlds, condemned to wander forever, while the other entity lived her life. The next day, Jessie's friends and family noticed a subtle change in her behavior. She seemed calmer, as if a great burden had been lifted. They attributed the transformation to the end of a difficult period, never suspecting the truth. And every night, exactly at 3:07 a.m., the real Jessie knocks 3 times at the door, hoping that one day someone will answer and free her from her eternal torment.